Happy Friday, everyone. Welcome to this live stream. It's my pleasure to introduce you to our guest today, Maurice Thornton. Thank you so much for joining us, Maurice. It's great to have you here today.
My pleasure, and thank you very much for having me.
You're the managing director at Headcount, a recruiting leader in pharma, medtech, and biotech based here in Switzerland. And the topic of today is how to hire your recruiting process as a company or as a startup here in Switzerland. So I'm sure we're going to have plenty of topics and tips and tricks to talk about. And I want to dive right into the first question. So what are the biggest mistakes that you see Swiss companies making when it comes to hiring?
Well, I mean, it depends. I mean, if you want to be really traditional, it differs a lot between our international clients and our Swiss clients. And actually, it's always very funny. The Swiss always want the full dossier. And they want to read every single reference letter that has ever been written about any person. And then they will bring up a line in paragraph 3 and say, I don't like the looks of this, because there used to be, this secret coded system of 1 to 6 when you wrote these reference letters. This is all over now, but a lot of companies still persist in that. Now, for your audience, I don't think that that's going to be so much the case. So I'd say one of the other things that people really discount in today's market is speed. Like you might have an interview, you don't hear back for 2-3 weeks. In the meantime, your competition, they're getting through their series of interviews super fast. They're more agile. They make the first offer, and you still haven't got back to them after the first interview. That is universal. We see it all the time, and that's what we're there to do. We're there to try and push that forward. But that's candidates tell me all the time, like, I just never heard back, or they were too slow. And I'd say probably, and this is also kind of universal, is understanding the levers, like in someone's decision-making process. You've got fuel and friction, and by fuel, I mean, you might try to throw more money at them, but you're not understanding the friction, like what's actually stopping them from moving forward? Why are they hesitating? And that's one of the questions that we have all the time. Like, if you got the offer today, are you going to take the offer? And if they hesitate or they're not sure, you need to explore that further, and companies just don't do it. They try to kind of bash it home with a signing bonus or something like that, when all this person wants to do is maybe meet their kids after school or something like that.
Yeah, fair points. Thank you for sharing those common mistakes that you see out there. And what I actually want to do is focus on the hiring process, basically the ideal hiring process for a startup. Usually, you probably start with identifying the hiring need. So before you can actually do that, is there any homework or anything that you need to have completed before you get started with the hiring process at all?
Well, I mean, job description is usually good, although in my experience, what's written and what's actually required are two completely different things in a lot of cases. I'd say that you need to be able to explain to the room in 3 to 4 bullets, 3 to 4 sentences, what this person's going to do and why they need to be there. And if you can't do that, you need to go back to the drawing board, because if you can't highlight what your needs are in those 3 to 4 bullets, you need to simplify. If it gets too complex, hiring gets very difficult, and then your wish list gets too long, and then your candidates get too little.
Are there also like good and bad reasons why you actually want to hire someone?
You mean in terms of creating the position?
Exactly. Like sometimes it's a very good idea to hire someone because you just have so much work to do. So you definitely need someone. But I could also imagine that there might be bad reasons to hire someone what will then eventually backfire later down the road after you made the hire.
Yeah. I mean, again, this is much more common in maybe larger companies with more cash flow, is that they've got a budget. Or they've got a hiring budget, and they don't want to lose their team. They don't want to have a smaller team, so they'll just hire somebody to fill that position. Because, the cardinal rule is if your position is vacant for too long, why do you need it? You're still effective. So I'd say that's a pretty bad reason to hire somebody. On the good side, I mean, if you're being pulled away from your core competency too much. I mean, that wasn't the case with me when I started this up. I spent too much time on admin. I should have hired an admin much sooner, but I'm a little stricter with the money, and so it was a really kind of tough decision for me to make. But it was the best decision I ever made.
Yeah. And I also wonder, when you actually do kick off the hiring process, who should own it? Is it usually the startup founder, or Is it more a topic or role-specific owner that should guide and also own the hiring, the recruiting process?
I think you got to trust your people. I mean, if you're a startup owner and you've got a team under you, and that you've got layers, so you've actually got managers managing managers, you need to kind of let that go. I think you got to trust a little bit. I think it's fine for an owner maybe to step in at the last phase and just say, hey, okay, I'm going to give this my blessing, or this person my blessing.
Mm-hmm.
But to be micromanaging, again, that's something that pulls you away from your core competency. And as a CEO, that's directing traffic. It's not, being in the traffic. And I think that you really need to kind of step outside, let the people do their job, and the owner should really be the hiring manager. It's got to be them for the candidate impression too. I mean, I wouldn't want to meet somebody who's not going to be my boss as part of the process.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Also, just a quick heads up, if anybody has any questions for Maurice, feel free to post them in the comments so we can actually address them right here on the show. So if you have any burning questions about hiring, maybe also firing, or just in general recruiting, feel free to post them in the chat so we can address them right here. Before, you mentioned the importance of job descriptions. So are there any other documents that you should prepare before you actually start the recruitment process?
I would say probably an interview guide helps if you want to be that structured. I mean, some companies do it, some companies don't do it. But the thing is, what you'll end up is you get, I don't know, 4 or 5 people on an interview panel. This person goes in, them all individually. They all ask the same question.
Yeah.
Walk me through your CV, or why do you want this job? And you're not getting into areas in which you could. So if you coordinate ahead of time the topics that each individual should be covering through a document, so everybody's on the same page, they know exactly what they're supposed to cover, and then it gets covered in an efficient way. And it's a better candidate experience. I mean, it's one of the complaints we get is, I just got the same question 5 times.
Sure.
Yeah. That's not fun. I mean, and obviously it seems like there hasn't been any thought put into it. And in terms of preparing, I'd say read the CVs. I know it seems like you would take that for granted, but I don't know how many times I've sat with a hiring manager who's just literally kind of reading it as they walk in the room. It doesn't make a very good impression that you prepared yourself adequately, whereas your candidate's probably been pretty nervous about this interview for a week or two, and you're just breezing in. And we hear that a lot from people. It's like, this guy didn't even read my CV.
Yeah, that's an incredibly unprofessional attitude right there. I mean, if you want to attract top talent, they will probably get up and walk out, because that's just something that you don't want to work with. Yeah,
absolutely. But it happens all the time. I mean, people are busy, and recruiting's not always their job. So, you're running from meeting to meeting, or you're working on building what it is you're trying to build. And you may not have oversight on even who this person is or what they're even coming for. But, I think you have to make it a priority. And that's what most people don't do with recruitment. It's not their priority because I've got something else I need to do today. But it's a bit of a paradox, because having that person on board is going to make you less busy. But people don't take time to prioritize. So
yeah, it's the simple short versus long-term thinking, right?
Yep. I mean, I've got a deadline today, and I've got to rush to meet that before I have this interview at 3:00, and I get it done at 2:59, and maybe pull the CV up on my laptop, and I'm looking at it when I'm walking in the door. And I understand how it happens. Just trying to tell your listeners here to avoid that.
Good tip. Before, you also said that, yeah, exactly. Read the CV, like print that out and put it on your wall. Yeah. Before, you said the hiring manager should drive the process. Is there anyone else who should be included in the process? Because you probably also want to have other people that join the interviews or give you an assessment. So who else should be included in the hiring process?
Well, I mean, I say this with a bit of a caveat, because I'm assuming that there's no human resources involved here. And I mean, they're usually process owners, and they're managing process with the hiring manager front and center. But, for the smaller organizations, usually they've got an operations team who would probably look to do something like that. Who should be in the interviews? Stakeholders, usually, a level up. Involving peers is always a bit questionable. I mean, it's good to kind of get a sense of the candidate, but that should be more of an informal conversation. Like, hey, maybe in a second round, come and have coffee with the team, just so you can feel each other out. But peer interviews are sometimes tricky because you've got different motivations. People maybe feel threatened by somebody coming in, and they may act in a way that they shouldn't. I've seen it happen where people were intimidated by a very strong candidate and actually give negative feedback on them because they didn't want to look bad when this person came on board. So I think one level up stakeholders, people you're going to interact with a lot, or peers who would be maybe outside of your team. And usually, I mean, we would usually never involve a level down.
Got it.
Yeah.
We also got the first question here from Claire Marine. Thank you for asking it. She asks, she often sees startups having 100 plus positions open. Do you think that startups often look for quantity instead of quality? I think that we all know that, you go on a job platform and then you just see the same company over and over again. While there is rapid growth and they have a strong need for people, sometimes this can also leave the impression of, okay, it's sort of a PR or marketing gag to have this attention and this perception. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, look, in some cases, it's the job posting sites themselves that are actually driving this. So you will see the same thing, but it's probably the same job that's coming up all over the place. This is because of kind of the spider effect or the crawling that is done. But when you go on a company's own homepage and they have 100 plus positions open, I mean, it's not uncommon in larger companies. I think if you've got 100 plus positions open, you're not a startup anymore. I mean, just by I'd say if you have 100 open, you've either got huge funding and you're still small, in which case I don't think that they would look for quantity instead of quality. It certainly is an extremely bad strategy. And normally I would recommend staggering that hiring. You need to prioritize what's most important. A larger company hiring 100 positions at the same time is completely normal. They will have multiple locations. They'll have multiple people managing those processes so they can do the quality piece. But yeah, I mean, PR gig, sure. But if you're a startup with maybe one person managing this, in terms of recruitment, 100 positions is an impossible task to do at the same time. Most people max out at 25. You can't do more than that.
Yeah, that's a fair assessment. Thank you for the question. Keep them coming. And that's actually also a good segue into the next question. Talking about job platforms, very often startups ask themselves, where should I actually advertise my open position? Of course, my own website, I put it there, but what platforms, what other channels should I use and leverage to get the word out and to also attract the best candidates?
You need to build a culture of ambassadors within your company. People that are there, I mean, I don't want to say they don't want to bleed to be there, but they should have some passion for where they work. And when they do, this results in a better networking. When somebody comes in with a referral, it's a much more valuable candidate than somebody who I don't know who's just applied. If you don't leverage your staff, you're missing out on a huge potential. We often find that referrals work really well for us. I might call somebody up and say, hey, I've got this great job for you. Yeah, I just signed somewhere else. Do you know anybody? And, we make that part of our culture here to ask that. And the amount of times we get great people coming in like that, it's incredible. Posting jobs, I mean, sure, we do that. It is a little bit of a PR thing, to be honest, because we rarely get qualified candidates. And the jobs that we recruit for are extremely difficult to fill and highly competitive. As if we're talking anything in tech, it's the same story. So finding quality candidates who would come into kind of more senior or long-term positions, it's tough with portals. So that's why I'm saying there's other ways. Develop processes like, hey, when somebody has a new job and they refer it into the group, what should happen next? Do these people put it up on LinkedIn? Do they everyone promise to call 3 people? It can be anything like that. But if you create a culture of employee ambassadors, you're gonna improve your hiring quality and speed.
That's an amazing tip. How do you actually get to that stage? Like, what do you do? Do you also offer like cash incentives for people who successfully refer someone, or do you just really build the culture that they just want to do that because they love working at your place? What's the best way to actually build those ambassadors? Because it sounds great in theory, but I can imagine it's not that easy to actually do in practice.
Well, it's the same as anything, prioritization, right? If I'm really busy and somebody says, hey, can you call 3 friends? I'm probably not going to do it. So it's all about what drives, human behavior, and that's normally it's reward or it's punishment. You definitely don't want to start punishing people for this. So yeah, reward is very common. Like cash reward is very common, but you also need to know what motivates your people. Maybe they want a week of extra holidays. I don't know. People like to free time and work-life balance has become so much of a theme in the last 3 to 5 years that oftentimes, I had one boss who used to do a pillow pass. Meant you could sleep in the morning. If you'd done something, you got to stay in bed for the morning. And then you could use it whenever you wanted. But the team loved that. Everybody wanted to get a pillow pass.
Pillow pass, that's amazing.
Yeah. But I think you need to find out what people want and then give them that when they successfully bring somebody into your team, because there's a huge value in that.
Yeah, amazing. And that's also, a good question to ask. How can I actually stand out as a startup? So the pillow pass or the perks that you can offer there are one starting point. What else can I do as a startup to stand out in the recruiting, in the hiring process from other companies? Because especially here in Switzerland, people have so many good options to choose from. And often with the salary that I can offer as a startup, it's pretty difficult to compete with Google or who else is here, the big corporates. So how can I stand out as a startup and still attract that top talent for my company?
Well, this is a question. When you talk about Google's hundreds of thousands of people versus, a 10 to 15 person company, in that company, you're going to get to be much more broad in your job. You're going to touch way more things. You're going to see things move. And not to say that Google is not fast moving, but it can't be as fast moving as a 10 to 15 person company. It's got structure and process. But with all that said, I still think that the perks, like I mentioned before, free time is so important these days. People want that flexibility. COVID taught us all of this, that, it can be done from home. And I think one big thing is, and I say it all the time, you hire grown-ups, you hire responsible people who are, because, a lot of people who are getting into the startup scene can tend to be earlier in their career and maybe need more structure. You need to give them that, but then also the trust. Just because you don't see them doesn't mean they're not working. I think trust is a big thing. And if you build a trusting culture, again, those employees are going to, when that person comes in for an interview, they're going to see how people feel working there. And if you can do that, I think you're just going to attract a different type of person. There's just people who want to go to work at Google because it's Google and they want to have that brand name check on their CV. Yeah. And then there's people who just work differently than that. They want to be in a smaller environment. They want to be in a more familial environment. So I think you've got to look at what your actual values are. And if you haven't defined them as a company, you should probably consider doing it, because this is the best way to communicate to your potential candidates what you are. And if you can play on those strengths, you've got a bit of a shot against Google.
Nice. And, we mentioned like platforms are probably not the best way to do the top quality recruitings for your company. But still, if you had to recommend or choose 1 or 2 platforms that you would recommend startups to check out and to be present on, what would you select?
Well, I think LinkedIn is unavoidable, but I don't want to be that obvious. I guess everybody kind of knows that you need to be there. One that we really like is join.com. We've been using them for a while now. Again, it's one of these like spider/crawler, but posting there has brought us, actually, when I say, posting doesn't bring us great candidates, but with that platform, we've actually had really great success.
Nice.
They might not always be people that fit the jobs that we are recruiting for at the time, but we can spot them and say, hey, this looks like a great talent. Let's speak to them anyway. And we keep them on the side until something does come up, and then we get in touch. And we've had some really strong success with that platform. Yeah,
we just had a quick conversation with one of the founders yesterday. He joined an event of ours, and they do a phenomenal job out of Berlin, and are also rapidly growing. So it's a really cool company, and happy to hear that they deliver good results.
They deliver great results, and not to knock the UK, but the UK, it's a recruitment hub. This is kind of the European home of recruitment, and a lot of the sites cater to that market. And, we're in discussions with another company, been around for a long time and, great stuff, but they don't attract the candidates here.
Yeah.
I get a lot of people applying out of, Sweden and the UK, but not people based in Switzerland.
Absolutely. So now we talked about the advertising part of the recruitment process, but of course, then there's also the whole interviewing and selection process. That's exactly what we're going to talk about next. So the toughest, or one of the toughest decisions you actually have to make is, now you receive all these applications and you need to decide who you're going to invite for an interview and who you already declined before even inviting them to an interview. So how do I identify the right people to interview without even talking to them before that?
Yep. The way that I train people here is to find a reason not to bring them in.
Okay.
So maybe you have language requirements. The first thing you should look at is the languages. You don't need to lead, like if you know that you need German, English, French to be successful in this job, and that's how you've defined it, we don't read the top part. We go straight to the language section. If those 3 languages aren't there fluent, see you later.
Yep.
And it's the easiest and most efficient way to do it. I think they say I've heard so many different things. It's something like 5 seconds up to 15 seconds we'll spend on average on the CV. I think it can even be below 5 seconds for our guys here, because that's what we're looking for. Mm-hmm. Surprisingly, the way that they put together the document as well is usually something that, sometimes it just looks so bad that I think, how could somebody put this together and send it out to the public? And for those reasons, like, or I had a guy apply for a data strategy position last week by post. I mean, I'm not going to look at that CV. I mean, you're in data, you're in digital, and you're applying by a post. Maybe it was trying to stand out. But how you present the document itself, I think, is also important. Mm-hmm. And then beyond that, I think there's other things to consider, like location, for example. It's always a little bit more complicated, and we find that we're more prone to losing people at a later stage of interview if they need to relocate. So if you don't broach that topic up front, mm-hmm. And say, you need to speak with your family or your loved ones about this relocation before you get in this process. Yep. We found by doing that up front, we really reduce the loss of candidates later on. Yep. Yeah.
Do you also run any questionnaires, to sort of check on these things, where people can hand in or even upload their CV, but also have to answer some qualification questions like we would probably do in sales? That's where I come from. Yeah. Do you do any of that part in the early recruitment process to help you decide who to interview and who not to interview?
So there's a couple of things. Another shout out to join.com. They will do that in the application process. So you can choose 3 to 5 questions that are killer criteria, and that person basically is almost immediately removed from the process. We had great success developing some back-end tools which ran surveys on our website. One of the big problems with us is that we had a lot of unwanted applications from fresh graduates, and our mm-hmm. clients don't hire fresh graduates from us. There are other agencies that do that, but it's just not us. Yep. And so by putting questionnaires in place, and at the end we said, you can still apply, but the odds we're going to get in touch are really small. Yep. And this increased our candidate quality dramatically. And we also spent less time looking at irrelevant CVs. So yeah, Definitely use the tech. It's there, and it's not that hard to develop.
Absolutely. And, ask differently. Now you said you look for reasons why they should not be invited. On the other hand, what really catches your interest in a candidate even before you interview them? Is there anything that really stands out that, surprises you positively, or that where you say, whoa, I want to talk to that person?
Well, they're at the competitor doing the same job, it's like, you come from sales. We recruit a lot of salespeople, and they know the market and they know the buyers. Mm-hmm. And that's the thing. If you can take a guy and slot him in, plug and play, that's what gets me usually the most excited, to be honest. But it's so rare that we get an application from a perfect candidate. That's why we're here. We don't really deal much, like in the applications more, we're going after people constantly. And so that's usually the first kind of profiles we go after.
Right. And you also quickly mentioned about the dossier, basically the CV. Usually people also add a cover letter. Is that something that you still look at? Does that make sense to include the cover letter, or is it something that people should better leave out? What do you think?
Different strokes for different folks. I mean, I personally, we don't look at it at all.
Okay.
I mean, you can write all the nice things you want about yourself.
Of course. I hope you're the best salesman about to sell yourself. Otherwise, something's wrong.
But they're not facts. And we look for facts when we're recruiting. I'm looking at the data on your CV. If I want to clarify something around motivation, location, then maybe I'll go back and refer to it. And people always ask me, oh, should I make a cover page? No, it's really okay. I'm going to build my own image of you by having an interview with you or looking at your CV.
Right.
Versus, and it's also long form text. So, you have to sit and read for 2 minutes.
Yeah.
I mean, we don't have 2 minutes, unfortunately.
Yeah. But then for you, it's also another red flag if you leave the cover letter completely out as a candidate.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and that's the thing. I have some clients who say they absolutely want a written motivation letter.
Right.
Again, I'm much more of a in-person, I want to have that conversation with somebody as opposed to reading why they're great. And we create cover letters for our clients, but the clients have asked us, hey, we want to know about X, Y, and Z. Mm-hmm. And so we're exploring those topics with the candidates and then drafting reports based on that. Yeah. But when you're writing a cover letter, you don't necessarily know exactly what the company wants to know.
Yeah, right.
If you somehow have some insight into that, then great. And if you're going to do it, I mean, please tailor it. I mean, I don't know how many times I've got CVs with not my name. They write it to somebody else.
Yeah.
The job that they're applying for is wrong. People are sitting there blasting CVs out when they're looking for a job. And if you're going to do that, I mean, and we also talk about tailoring the CV. You've all heard it before, but man, I mean, please do that, people. I mean, it's going to make me much more likely to invite you.
Yeah, otherwise it gives you way more reasons to not invite you, right? As we heard before.
Exactly. I mean, we tell some candidates to look at the job description, look at all the things that you can do in that, and write your CV based on it. And it's not a huge amount of work, and you don't want to be lying about anything either. But but I think candidates that have actually shown a real kind of commitment to taking the time to tailor something, I think counts for motivation. And we often get cover letters for candidates who are underqualified, to be honest. Mm-hmm. They need to make that extra effort. Like I said before, if I have got the perfect candidate coming from the competitor, I don't need to see his cover letter. I'm really happy to speak to that guy. Usually they don't do it because they know exactly that they're good. So,
So now let's assume we found the right candidates that you want to interview. Mm-hmm. What's an interview process that you recommend in terms of how many interviews should you do? Should you do them in person or remotely? What's your suggested setup there?
For me, I always pick up the phone and call people. At the beginning, of COVID, it was all Zoom gloom on 8 hours, 10 hours in front of the screen. So I actually went back to using the phone, to be honest, because I get up and I move around a little bit. I kind of like that. And I have a first call with people normally just to kind of get a sense of why they applied. And then I want to tick some boxes. And these are simple admin questions. What's your notice period? What's your salary expectation? Because again, these are criteria that can kill the recruitment very fast. And again, a lot of, fail fast. That's one of the mottos in startup community in recruitment too. I want those people who are going to take my time later on out of the process as fast as possible.
Sure.
If somebody's got unreasonable salary expectations, or they can't be physically present if they need to be, or they can't relocate and I need them to, there could be any number of things that come up. I mean, we often, when we're relocating a family, we'll go into what the spouse does for a living, because we found only later that somebody might be a medical doctor, and that's great. Mm-hmm. But if you live in the UK and you need to relocate to Basel, you can't work in the hospital there. You don't have a license. You can't speak the language. Yeah. So although the spouse might be the original candidate is qualified, the spouse will not get a job, and this creates friction once they arrive, and usually leads to relocating back within a year. So I want to be sure that I get all of that admin stuff before I get into anything about their capabilities. I've seen their job description. I've seen their CV. I know what jobs they've done. That first call is 20 minutes maybe, and then I can get rid of, I don't know, 3/4 of the people almost.
Nice. Yeah.
At that stage. Yeah.
What happens
it's good for them as well.
Sure.
Then video. And I think that if you haven't got on board with this yet, it's time. I mean, some of our clients, even before COVID, were pretty good about they would decide on people without having to meet them face to face. And they said, we work like this. So, somebody's actual presence on video is important. So there, I think I personally, I like to meet people. I do like to sit in the room with them, because we are a one location company, and everybody's here. So it's not that we work constantly, on video. We see each other. There's like a bunch of people in the next room.
Sure.
So yeah, I think that you need to have a combination of it. But if you don't involve video at least some point, especially for candidates who are further away. But yeah, at the end stage, normally a lot of our clients like to meet face to face where possible.
Yeah. And what do you then ask after the first call, the second call, or even the third call? What do you discuss there? What do you ask them, and what do you also assess there? What are you looking for?
So I look for three main things. I look for competence. So is somebody actually able to do the job? Can they give me examples of them successfully doing it? I mean, that's a competency-based recruitment or behavioral-based recruitment questions. Give me an example of a time where you did X. What happened? And you often find by drilling down into this, that the guy starts out saying he led the project, and turns out then he was just part of the project, and then it turns out he was, assistant to the project manager. And people will often generalize, and this project that we were on, and okay, but wait, what exactly were you doing? And you really get into the nitty gritty and just be curious. You often find that people, I mean, I have no problem with people trying to sell themselves, but you're getting facts.
Sure.
So that's getting competence. Motivation is huge. I think that I prefer to hire a less talented, more motivated person in many cases, because they are dedicated to what you're trying to do. And when you have that, you have a team that pulls together, and then you've got the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, right?
Now, how do you actually test for motivation? How do you find out how motivated someone is?
Well, we sometimes ask them on a scale of 1 to 10.
Okay.
How
I mean, they could say anything there, right?
They can say whatever they want, but then why? A 10.
Sure.
Okay. I'm suspicious of a 10 right away. If I'm getting 8s and 9s, I think it's good. There should always be some hesitation. It's jumping into something completely new for you. You don't know. I mean, maybe the guy sitting next to you turns out to be a total ass. I don't know. I mean, you don't know that. So there's always a bit of risk. And if people will give me kind of that 8 or 9, like, okay, and then why is that? Why is it not a 10? You can get into those kinds of questions, and then you find out that they've got maybe some reasonable hesitations. And then it's also by their actions. Like the way that people communicate throughout a process is key. When you're getting like everybody's got a phone, everybody's checking their email, and if this guy's not getting back to me for 10 days,
of course,
that's just a very clear way to realize somebody's not interested. And the last thing I said, what we look for is also opportunity. So competence, motivation, and opportunity, or stretch, we call it sometimes. It's like, if you're going to come in and you're not going to learn something, or you're not going to grow, then maybe you're not the right hire. Like I said before, hiring the guy directly from the competition, sure, who can do the job, but that person's got to see perspective in your organization. And I think a lot of smaller companies struggle with that, because you've got a founder or a founding group, and getting above them is usually never happening. So you kind of get stuck. And then that's the reason a lot of people leave, or they go and start their own thing, is because they're in small companies. It's hard to offer further development. And I think through training and trying to, manage your talent, that can be avoided. But in a lot of cases, small companies, they lose people for that reason.
Yeah, that's crucial to really also maintain the good employees, basically, because they want to grow. Yep,
and it's easier to keep them than it is to find new ones.
Yeah.
And train them up and get them familiar with culture and who does what. I mean, it's already in a small company, it's difficult.
Absolutely.
Big ones don't get so affected. 1,000 people and you lose one, nobody notices. Yeah. But if you're 10 and you lose one, it actually has a bit of an impact. Yeah,
100%. One thing that also, if I think back into our own hiring decision, something that I always liked to determine the motivation was basically, what are your personal goals? Like, where do you want to go in life? And then trying to map that to the company goals. And if you do have an overlap there, that's really where you can have a very strong motivation, a really strong desire also to be part of it, because you see how the company goals, the company's vision will basically pay on your personal goals and it will get you there. And it's not always easy to assess, but that's something that I found really helpful to determine the motivation, because if the personal, the company goal matches, you are basically sitting in the same boat.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the classic one is, where do you want to be in 5 years? You know, that's
Sure,
a pretty standard question.
Yeah.
But I do like the personal side of it that you've mentioned now, because like I said before, some people don't want to crawl or climb all the way to the top or claw their way to the top. You know, some people just aren't built like that. They want to go, they want to do a good job, and they want to enjoy their life. And I mean, because is it work to live, or is it live to work? And a lot of people are living to work these days. I mean, you know, our clients, they work 60, 70 hours a week sometimes. And you just like, and everybody's burnt out and stressed. And some people have taken a life decision that that's not what they want. So when you say, like, you know, are you happy to, you know, be in here on weekends, things like that. If somebody's not super motivated to do that, it's not a negative thing, but you need to align, as you say, on the personal side as well. Absolutely. Yeah.
Fully agree. What are some red flags that you see from a candidate that really scare you off and say, oh, that's not going to work? That's a huge red flag for me.
When you trash a former employer, it's like what they say. If somebody gossips to you about somebody else, they're probably gossiping about you behind your back. Yeah, and it's the same thing. You know, it's if a candidate says to me, you know, okay, so but why did you leave? Oh, you know, it was a terrible organization. They weren't well, but it just, you know, for me, there's a much more diplomatic answer that you can give. And normally what I find is that it's kind of, it's based on the person, because once you get into more, it turns out that everywhere sucked. You know, maybe it's not everywhere that sucks. It's probably you. And that's the harsh reality of it. And we often will get into conflict questions. You know, I think conflict is a good thing in the workplace. You should have it. People should have differences of opinion. That's how we get the best ideas out. But it's all in how you handle it. And we often find that, like, when people say, oh, never had a conflict, this is a big red flag for me. Those who've had too much, obviously. But you know, those who get into conflicts, why they happen and how they were resolved, especially the ability to change a point of view, I think is a pretty good trait in somebody to have. And then the other thing is to kind of go back to what I mentioned previously, is how are they actually communicating with me in this process? You know, it's so simple, like, write a follow-up. Thank you for having me in today. People don't do it. I mean, it's amazing to me that you just don't. And I have to call people up and say, okay, now did you write them a message to say thanks? And, you know, and it just shows the way that you communicate. And that's key to any business these days, is solid communication lines. And, you know, and people are jerking me around. I understand people get sick and sometimes they might have to miss an interview, but when are you letting me know? Is it 20 minutes before you're supposed to be there? You know, these types of things, just basic responsible behavior. And it's very common that people don't do that, or they just won't show up for an interview. We've had that happen. I mean, that's not even a red flag. That's just beyond. But yeah, for me, that's really key. You get to understand that these people, they really do want this job, and that, like I said before, motivation, I count pretty high.
Yeah. And then now assume you have your top 3 to 5 candidates. You interviewed them. You think, yeah, those people, they would make a good fit. Who and how do you actually make the final hiring decision?
It's usually a group decision, right? I mean, you pull the interview panel into a room. And, you know, I've been part of so many of these conversations, and, you know, we often try to put these systems in place, and in the end, they just say, oh, I like that guy, you know, and these are highly paid, very, very professional people. And it just comes down to, yeah, you know what, I liked him too. Yeah, that was a good guy, you know, and they don't get into the crux of it. But often we do hire people that we like. But I think that especially for a group that may be somewhat disjointed or has different interests, because oftentimes when a person comes on, they're a resource to be used in a way. And some managers might say, hey, it'd be great if you could help me out for this. And so what are the group's motivations for bringing that person on? And I think that has to be very clear from the beginning, is that, we're selecting this person to do these tasks, and you don't drift away from that. And in the feedback session, there you can also use scoring systems. I mean, a lot of companies do that, where you will rate people. But the thing is with that, I've seen so many times where the highest rated person isn't the one they want, because people have a gut feeling and you can't rate that. And that's the hard part. So you try to put a system in place to give you a framework, and that'll usually get you your top two. And then, people will usually just make a call from there. And it's a vote. You're not always going to get everybody agreeing, but hiring manager, final decision usually, and he can choose to go against the group. I mean, we've had that before as well. Sure. But they know that they're out on a limb at that point. So, big risk for them kind of going against the group. But I think risk taking should also be rewarded. I mean, if it's not done recklessly. Yeah.
What about any, background checks or also reference checks? Do you also do that along the process?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, background checks is not something that we conduct. I mean, this is not a core part of what we do, but if you are, and usually you're going to use a third-party provider to do that. And a startup maybe does not want to spend that money. But the thing is, it's not that hard. We've done quite a bit of this over the years. It's just not a core competency. But if a client says, we need you to do it, all right, we're going to do it. Hey, you just call up their university. Okay, did they get that degree? That confirm employment with all the employers. And usually then they can run their own, I don't even know the English word, but the Betreibungsauszug. Where they can just go basically and say, look, I'm not in trouble with anyone. And once you have all that put together, I think it's enough. The only place where I would really recommend going a little bit deeper is probably finance. Your finance guy, whoever's got access to the money, who can spend it. I mean, we've seen stories. I mean, like people just stealing from companies.
Yeah, of course.
And usually you might want to go a little bit deeper on those. So that can be worth the investment. But keep in mind that if you go with one of these major background check companies, you usually they're going to want you to sign up for big money, and just to do one check. They're not often very interested in that. And then your check is usually outsourced to Eastern Europe somewhere with somebody who's in a call center. So I think that if you're more invested, you can probably do a better check yourself, especially if we're local here in Switzerland. And then the reference checks was the second thing you mentioned. Absolutely. I mean, we do that for every single person that we place. But we don't call it a reference check. We call it more of an onboarding guide for our clients. Okay. So they've selected this person. And we sometimes run references when we're not really sure about somebody. But a reference check by definition is stupid. So, all right, I say, so then, can you give me 3 people that I could talk to about you? And who are you going to pick?
Yeah, of course. The people that are going to speak well about me, yeah.
Right. So in 60 years doing this, and twice, I've had a reference check really kill a candidate process. Okay. And they dig. But people are there to say good things. You've got to also say, okay, what are the weaknesses? Perfectionist, workaholic, you get all this stuff coming in from references. They only want to say good things, and that's what they're there to do. So we try to flip it a little bit and say, we've already kind of made a decision for this person. We've met them, we like them, we think that they can do the job, but we also want to know how they work and how they can be best integrated into our team. And that's advice that a former manager or peer could give. I mean, you talk about red flags when we get references sometimes, and you never have a single manager in those references. It's all peers or whatever. Then a reference check can be useful as, like, by definition, you're not really getting a manager's reference. And we look for that. But all in all, it's kind of an old practice, and it makes sense. And we back channel a lot as well. I mean, everybody knows everybody. Somebody who knows somebody, and you just call them up and say, okay, what do you think? That's when you get an honest reference. And with startup communities, people know each other. And I'd say if you're going to do a reference check, kind of an informal one, it's never anything official. But it often can be valuable.
Nice. Yeah, I think that's a good tip. Otherwise, you just don't get to the full truth. most likely.
Yeah. I mean, like I said, reference checks are stupid in a way.
And then once you made the final decision, you know who you're going to hire. Then, of course, the whole onboarding part is also a crucial part of the process. I don't want to get into too much detail here, but do you have any, any final tips on the onboarding blueprint or onboarding tips? Because that's something that often gets forgotten or neglected to a certain degree, because then you think, oh, I found the candidate and now I just onboard them, but don't really pay too much attention anymore. That's sad if that happens.
Yeah, I mean, nothing sucks more than spending the first day on the phone with IT because you don't have a working laptop, or I don't know, no desk assigned to you. There's just been no preparation done prior to your arrival. It can have a pretty bad kind of employee experience. I'd say if I'm a manager or an owner or founder, I want to be sure that maybe a small gift, to welcome them. We often just do champagne, like a congratulatory bottle of champagne for them when they start. And get yourself and your team out for lunch on day 1, day 2, day 3, whenever, just to say, okay, you're here. We're really happy. It's a really simple, and then there's all the structural stuff like, getting them equipment, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, that should be a process that's not really something that helps you stand out, but it immediately makes them feel a little bit appreciated. They're taking a risk as well. And if you can start out on that right foot, I think that it makes a lot of sense and goes a long way.
I like that. Yeah. I mean, in the end, you're sitting in the same boat. You want to make that company successful, and everybody will be better off with that if that happens. So think about it like from a positive point of view, I would say.
Treat them nice.
Yeah.
It's not complicated. It's just often overlooked because I'm busy. I've got a deadline. I don't have time to do that today. You need to make time for that. I think it's important.
Absolutely. So, hey, that was a lot of fun and very insightful, Maurice. Thank you so much for joining us today. Are there any final tips or anything else that you would like to add to today's conversation?
Get back to people. Okay, we're all guilty of this. You get a lot of applications, and maybe you even speak to some people, and it just slips. You go, I spoke to that. Did I ever get back to that person? And then it just becomes like, oh, I wasn't really interested in them anyway. The number one complaint that we hear is that, from candidates is, I never heard back. And you know what? I would never want to work for that company. Or even people who go to interview in person and never get a call to be told if they're going to be selected or not, where they have to actually call up and say, guys, what's going on? They're never going to come work for you. Maybe you don't want them, but they're going to go talk to 5 other people.
Yeah, exactly. Then you have the right opposite effect of what you want to have, right? Then you have people talking badly about you, and that's not good.
Call up. It takes 2 minutes to provide feedback. Sure. Look, we did go with somebody else. This is the reason. And we often try to give very genuine, honest feedback. Like your interview style was terrible. You didn't provide good examples, so they can learn from that. Yeah. And I think that's valuable, and it's at least owed, especially when someone spends the time to come and meet you.
Absolutely. I think that's a wonderful point to end today's conversation. Maurice, thank you so much for joining us. And everybody listening or watching to this, have a wonderful weekend ahead of you, and hope to see you here again soon for a next live Q&A session. Take care, everyone.
Thanks very much.